They called them hospitals, places meant to heal the mind. But behind locked doors in the Victorian era, something far darker was happening. Patients weren't just treated, they were controlled, punished, silenced, broken. Some begged to leave, others begged to die. But once you were inside, you didn't get better. You disappeared. Part 1. Inside the Victorian Asylum, 300 words. In the 19th century, mental asylums spread rapidly across Britain and Europe. They were built with a promise: to treat the mentally ill with care and science. But the reality inside many of these institutions was very different. Facilities like Bedlam became infamous not for healing, but for what patients endured within their walls. From the outside, these buildings appeared grand and orderly. Tall windows, clean architecture, structured layouts. But inside, the atmosphere was heavy. Cold corridors echoed with distant sounds. Locked doors lined the halls, and patients, often misunderstood rather than truly ill, were kept under strict control. At the time, mental health was poorly understood. Behaviors that today might be recognized as anxiety, trauma, or depression were often labeled as madness. And once labeled, escape was nearly impossible. Patients could be admitted by family members, doctors, or even authorities, with little ability to challenge the decision. Some were sent away for life. Inside, strict discipline ruled everything. Silence was expected, obedience was enforced, and those who didn't comply faced consequences. Because in these asylums, treatment wasn't always about healing. It was about control, and for many patients, what came next would become the most terrifying part of all. Inside Victorian asylums, discipline was not optional. It was enforced, often in the name of treatment. Doctors and staff believed that controlling the body could somehow restore the mind, and so many practices were introduced, not as punishments, but as cures. One of the most common was restraint. Patients who resisted, spoke too loudly, or showed distress could be strapped into devices designed to limit movement. Chairs, beds, and full-body restraints kept them still for hours, sometimes days. Another method was isolation. Small, dark rooms, barely furnished, were used to confine patients who were seen as disruptive. No conversation, no light, no sense of time, just silence. Then came the more disturbing practices. Cold water treatments became widespread. Patients were submerged in freezing baths or subjected to sudden bursts of cold water, believed to shock the mind back into order. Some were wrapped tightly in wet sheets and left immobile as the fabric dried and tightened around them. All of it controlled, all of it deliberate. Places like Bedlam became known not just for housing patients, but for the harsh methods used within. And yet, many of these actions were considered progressive at the time. Doctors recorded results, wrote reports, claimed improvement. But for the patients experiencing it, it didn't feel like treatment. It felt like punishment, because the line between care and control had completely blurred. And once that line disappeared, anything could be justified. Beyond restraints and isolation, Victorian asylums employed instruments designed to instill fear and obedience. One notorious device was the straitjacket. Made of heavy canvas and leather, it could completely immobilize a patient's arms, sometimes for hours on end. The sensation was suffocating, leaving the body aching and the mind anxious. Mechanical chairs were another tool. Patients could be strapped into these devices, often in awkward positions, designed to prevent movement entirely. Some chairs had metal fittings that pressed painfully against the body. Then there were shock therapies. Electrical currents were sometimes applied to patients with little understanding of their effects. The goal was compliance, not healing. The jolts caused extreme pain and terror, leaving permanent psychological scars. Cold water treatments reached terrifying extremes. Some patients were dunked repeatedly in ice-cold baths. Others were wrapped in wet sheets, then exposed to cold air, effectively forcing the body into shock. Staff claimed these methods purified the mind, but survivors described them as torture. Punishments were also psychological. Patients were deliberately misled, threatened, or humiliated to maintain control. Minor acts of defiance, speaking out of turn, refusing medication, or showing fear could provoke prolonged restraint or isolation. Even daily routines were weaponized. Meals, sleep, and light were controlled, reinforcing a sense of helplessness. Every action, every word, every glance could result in punishment. While society praised asylums as cutting-edge medical institutions, behind closed doors the reality was brutal. The combination of physical instruments, harsh treatments, and psychological terror created an environment where survival required absolute compliance. And even then, suffering was inevitable. Victorian asylums were not just medical facilities, they were prisons disguised as hospitals, and for the patients inside, each day was a battle for dignity, sanity, and life itself. Amid the terror of Victorian asylums, some patients survived, but their experiences were nightmarish. Records from facilities like Bedlam Hospital reveal chilling accounts. Patients confined in dark rooms for weeks, sometimes months, with only cold meals to sustain them. Some were strapped in chairs or beds for hours after the slightest act of defiance. Doctors often justified these methods as necessary for treatment, but survivors' testimonies paint a different picture. They spoke of constant fear, the cold seeping into their bones, and the agony of immobility. Silence was enforced so strictly that even whispering could result in punishment. One common horror was the spinning chair, a device that rotated patients rapidly to retrain the mind. While considered innovative at the time, it caused extreme dizziness, nausea, and sometimes permanent injury. Another was the dunking chair, a wooden contraption used to repeatedly submerge patients in ice-cold water. Staff claimed it restored mental balance, but many described it as sheer torture. Even minor offenses, speaking back, refusing medication, or attempting to leave, could trigger extended confinement, sometimes in rooms with little light or ventilation. Yet, some patients found small ways to resist. They would memorize routines, anticipate staff behavior, or communicate secretly with others. These acts of defiance, though small, were vital for preserving a sense of self. Despite enduring unimaginable conditions, a few left behind memoirs or letters that gave voice to their suffering. These documents revealed not just cruelty, but resilience, the human capacity to survive even the harshest institutions. Victorian asylums may have been built in the name of healing, but for many, they became places of punishment, fear, and psychological torment. Their stories serve as grim reminders of how the powerless were trapped by both authority and science. The story of Victorian asylums does not end with their closure. Though reforms began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the horrors experienced by patients left lasting scars, both physically and psychologically. Survivors often carried trauma for decades, their experiences hidden behind polite society's veil of propriety. These institutions were products of their time. Society misunderstood mental illness, treating difference and dissent as danger. Science was limited, and authority was absolute. As a result, punishment was mistaken for treatment, and control was mistaken for care. Yet the legacy of these asylums also includes lessons. They remind us how easily compassion can be overshadowed by fear, authority, and misunderstanding. They show the necessity of empathy in medicine and the dangers of institutional power without oversight. Today, modern mental health care emphasizes patient rights, informed consent, and humane treatment, values that were often absent in Victorian institutions. But the echoes of the past remain, and historians, psychiatrists, and human rights advocates continue to study this era to prevent repetition of such abuses. Memorials, museums, and research into historical asylum practices preserve the stories of those who suffered. They serve as warnings, highlighting the consequences of neglect, ignorance, and cruelty disguised as care. The most terrifying punishments of Victorian asylums were not just physical, they were systemic. They relied on fear, isolation, and the stripping away of autonomy. And while some survived, their experiences reveal the dark side of a society that prioritized order and authority over compassion and understanding. The asylums are gone, but their lessons remain. The stories of those trapped within their walls continue to teach the importance of empathy, vigilance, and the human cost of neglecting mental health.